a childhood game on Halloween night, ended with my home address in the hands of two absolute monsters. It was 2016, a few days before Halloween, and the air in our quiet suburban neighborhood had that perfect autumn chill, the kind that smells like dead leaves and distant bonfires. My friends and I, 6 of us in total, were getting bored of video games. We wanted to be out in the encroaching darkness, so we decided on a game of Fugitive. The rules were simple. Our team of 3 would hide, and after a 10-minute head start, we had to make it back to the safe zone, my friend Kyle's front porch, without being caught by the seekers. My friend Josh had the brilliant idea of hiding in an open casket someone had put on their lawn as a Halloween decoration. It was risky, being so close to the safe zone, but the seekers would never expect it. Meanwhile, my other friend Liam and I chose a classic spot, shimmying under the elevated porch where the seekers were counting, their voices rumbling like thunder just inches above our heads. We held our breath, listening to their footsteps fade as they began their hunt. After what felt like an eternity, we slid out from under the porch and began the tense journey back. We moved through the shadows, using overgrown hedges and parked cars as cover, the thrill of the game making our hearts pound. Up ahead, we saw the warm, welcoming light of Kyle's porch. Josh was already there, leaning against the railing, looking smug. We made a final, silent dash and slapped the porch railing, officially safe. We started chatting in hushed, victorious tones, laughing about our hiding spots, and waiting for the seekers to give up. That's when we first heard it. That low, guttural rumble of an old car engine slowly cruising down the street. It was an old sedan with chalky, chipped white paint that looked like peeling skin under the streetlights. It pulled up and parked directly in front of Kyle's house. And then, nothing. The engine cut out, plunging the street back into an unearthing silence. We figured it was one of Kyle's parents, but the minutes stretched on and nobody got out. 5 long, silent minutes. We tried to ignore it, to keep talking, but our voices were strained now. We were all watching that car. Then, 2 doors creaked open in perfect unison. 2 figures emerged, both dressed in loose, featureless black clothing. Except for their faces, they wore stark white, expressionless clown masks. They didn't run, they didn't sneak. They just walked towards us, their steps perfectly in sync, their heads tilted slightly as if studying prey. We were frozen. We tried to play it cool, our teenage bravado a flimsy shield against the pure menace rolling off these guys. "Hey, what's up?" Liam called out, his voice cracking. They stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and just stared. The silence was the worst part. It was heavy, suffocating. Then one of them began to growl. It wasn't human. It was a low, wet, animalistic sound from deep in his chest. The other one spoke, his voice a horrifying, flat monotone. "You kids are out far too late. You need to be more careful about who's watching." My hand was trembling as I did something stupid. I held out a cough drop I had in my pocket towards the growling clown. "Sounds like you've got a bad cough," I stammered. He lunged and grabbed my hand. His grip was like iron, impossibly strong, and I had to rip my hand free, stumbling backwards. At the same time, Liam, in a panic, tried to snap a picture with his phone. The other clown jerked his head forward with inhuman speed the moment the flash went off, and the resulting picture was a distorted, nightmare's close-up of a single, black, empty eye hole. We knew then that this wasn't a prank. The fear was real, a cold liquid in our veins. Finally, Josh found his voice. "Please," he whispered, "just leave us alone." For a moment that stretched into a lifetime, they didn't move. Then they turned and backed away to their car, their masked faces locked on us the entire time. They got in, the engine roared back to life, and they sped off into the night. We couldn't speak. We just stood there shaking until the seekers finally came around the corner, clueless and laughing about how they couldn't find us. We told Kyle's dad what happened, but he just chuckled and dismissed it as Halloween pranksters. It was another friend's dad who, after seeing the genuine terror on our faces, insisted on driving us all home. I thought it was over. I was in my room, the doors locked, trying to make my heart stop hammering against my ribs. Then I heard it again, that same low, rumbling engine. I crept to my window and looked down at the street. It was them. The old white car was parked right in front of my house. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The passenger window rolled down, and one of the clowns leaned out, its white face a beacon in the darkness. It looked directly up at my window, right into my eyes. Then it slowly raised a hand and gave me a single, deliberate wave before the car sped off, disappearing into the night for good. They hadn't just found us by chance during a game. They had followed us. And now, one of them knew exactly where I slept.
At 5 years old, I learned the only thing scarier than a monster outside your window is one that decides to run. My stepdad told me this story only once, and he told it with a tremor in his voice that a lifetime of trying to forget couldn't erase. In the early 90s, when he was 5, his dad was in the Air Force, stationed in a quiet corner of Missouri. They lived in one of those sleepy, suburban neighborhoods that bordered the base, a place of identical houses and an almost unnerving nighttime silence. His dad worked the night shift, leaving just him and his mom alone in the house. He was a restless kid and rarely slept, often staying up late, playing on the living room floor while his mom read or watched TV. On this particular night, at around 2 in the morning, the only sounds in the house were the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant hiss of the shower his mom had just started. He was on the plush carpet, engrossed in tangling and untangling a ball of red yarn, the fibers soft under his small hands. The living room's back wall was almost entirely a sliding glass door. It was a huge dark mirror reflecting the dimly lit room, and he knew that just beyond that thin sheet of glass was the backyard, and beyond that, a public pathway that cut through the neighborhood like a dark river. That's when a flicker of movement at the edge of the porch light's glow caught his eye. He paused, the yarn falling from his hands. It was probably just a deer or a neighbor's dog. He stared into the darkness, but saw nothing. He was about to go back to playing when the movement happened again, this time stepping just enough into the light to create a shape. It was tall, thin, and standing perfectly still. It wasn't an animal. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He watched, frozen, as the figure took one more deliberate step forward, revealing itself completely under the pale yellow light. It was a clown. It wore a baggy, ruffled suit, and its face was painted in a ghostly white with a smile that was too wide, too red. In one hand, it held the string of a single pale blue balloon that swayed gently in the night air. For what felt like an hour, it didn't move. It just stood there on the path, head tilted, its painted eyes fixed on the glass door. Fixed on him. He felt a scream building in his throat, but it was trapped by a paralyzing fear. He was just a little kid, and the only adult in the house was down the hall, lost in the sound of running water. Then, the clown did something that broke the spell. It slowly, deliberately raised one white-gloved hand and gave a small, jerky wave. That's when my stepdad found his voice. He opened his mouth and screamed, a high-pitched shriek of pure terror. "Mom!" The clown's reaction was instantaneous. The moment my stepdad's scream shattered the silence, it dropped its arm and bolted. It sprinted, its movements unnaturally fast, its feet kicking up gravel as it charged directly from the path towards the glass door. The blue balloon danced frantically behind it, and the painted smile seemed to stretch impossibly wide as it grew closer and closer. He scrambled backwards on his hands and feet, screaming hysterically as he turned and ran, his little legs pumping down the hallway towards the sound of running water, convinced the glass was about to explode behind him. He burst into the steamy bathroom, sobbing, trying to explain to his mother what he'd seen. She turned off the water, wrapping a towel around herself, her face a mixture of confusion and concern. She tried to calm him, assuring him it was just a bad dream, but his terror was too real to be ignored. Holding his hand, she cautiously led him back down the hallway to the living room. He peeked from behind her, his heart hammering. The room was empty. The yard was empty. The clown was gone. There was no sign it had ever been there at all. They called the police, who came and swept the yard with their flashlights. They were kind, but skeptical. A clown at 2 a.m. on a public path? They gently suggested that a 5-year-old's imagination could play tricks on him late at night. There were no footprints, no disturbances, nothing to prove it wasn't a dream. But my stepdad knows what he saw. He never stayed up late after that night, but for years he'd have nightmares of that painted smile rushing towards him in the dark. He's not sure what its intentions were, or what would have happened if that thin sheet of glass hadn't held. All he knows is that his lifelong fear of clowns began with a single, silent wave, followed by the sound of a monster running straight for him.
I used to dress up as a monster to scare people, until the night we found a real one. You have to remember what it was like back in 2016. The whole country was gripped by this bizarre killer clown panic. News reports were everywhere. It was a strange, paranoid time. And for a group of bored 18-year-olds in rural Texas with a box of cheap clown masks, it felt like an opportunity. I'm not proud of it. We knew it was a dumb, mean-spirited thing to do, but we weren't malicious. We were chasing an adrenaline rush, wanting to create a story we could tell later. We never got close enough to actually hurt anyone. We'd just stand at the edge of a dark field or a quiet street until we got a reaction. Then we'd melt back into the darkness. On this one particular Saturday in October, we decided to up the ante. We drove out to a spot known locally as Parker's Ridge, a network of dirt roads deep in the woods where couples went to be alone. The plan was simple: find a parked car, emerge from the trees, and give them a good scare. As we killed the engine and crept towards the main clearing, we could already hear voices, but they weren't the quiet, romantic whispers we expected. They were angry. Through a thicket of trees, we saw them. A single red pickup truck was parked, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Standing in the beams were a man and a woman. He was huge, a classic football player type, and she was a small redhead who looked tiny next to him. They were screaming at each other. We ducked down, deciding to wait for the fight to blow over before making our move. But it didn't blow over. It got worse. "It's over, Mark," she yelled, her voice trembling but firm. "I'm done. I'm calling Sarah to come get me." She pulled out her phone, and that's when he snapped. In one swift, brutal motion, he lunged forward and punched her in the face. The sound was sickening, a wet thud that cut through the night. She crumpled to the ground, and he was on her instantly, pinning her down, his voice a low snarl. "You're not leaving," he growled, raising his fist again. "You're never leaving me." Something inside us just broke. The game was over. This wasn't a prank. This was real. It was ugly, and it was happening right in front of us. Without a word, without a plan, my friend Mike just looked at me, his eyes wide behind his own stupid mask, and nodded. All four of us rose up from the darkness and charged. We didn't even think. We just ran out of the woods and into the headlights, screaming like madmen, waving our arms, a chaotic nightmare vision of painted smiles and colorful wigs. The guy, Mark, looked up from his assault, his face a mask of pure shock and terror. One second, he was a predator in complete control. The next, he was the target of a full-blown clown ambush. He scrambled off the girl, stumbled backwards, and then just ran. He didn't even look back, just threw himself into his truck and peeled out, spraying dirt and gravel everywhere. The girl was screaming too, but she wasn't looking at him, she was looking at us. She pushed herself up and bolted in the opposite direction, crying for help, running from her saviors. The clearing was suddenly silent again, except for the sound of our own heavy breathing. We stood there for a moment, the adrenaline draining away, leaving us feeling cold and hollow. We knew we had to get out of there before the girl found someone, before the cops came. As we turned to head back to our own truck, my friend pointed to the ground, to the spot where the girl had been pinned down. Dude, look. There, glinting in the dirt, was a Bowie knife. It was huge, with a blade at least 7 inches long. He must have dropped it when we charged, his panic making him clumsy. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a fight that got out of hand. He brought a weapon. He had a knife, and he was telling her she was never going to leave. We didn't just stop a beating. We might have stopped something far, far worse. We drove home in complete silence that night. We took off the masks and the makeup and packed them away in a box. We never did it again. The thrill was gone, replaced by the sickening feeling of what we had almost witnessed. We went out that night looking to be the monsters in someone else's story, but we ended up finding a real one. And I'll never forget the terrifying realization that sometimes the only thing that can stop a monster is another monster.
He never ran. He only whistled. And no matter how fast we fled, he was always right there. My girlfriend Sarah and I were invincible, or at least that's how it felt when we were 18. We lived in a small, quiet city where nothing ever happened, and our favorite thing to do was take long walks at night. There was a familiar comfort in the route between my house and hers, a path we'd walked 1,000 times under the soft glow of the streetlights. We knew every crack in the sidewalk, every house with a barking dog. It was our territory. It felt safe. One evening in late October, just as the sky was bruising into a deep purple, Sarah had an idea. "Let's go a different way," she said, a playful spark in her eye. "Aren't you bored of the same old route?" I agreed instantly. The idea of a small adventure was appealing. We turned onto a street we'd never explored, laughing and talking, enjoying the novelty of the different houses and unfamiliar gardens. But after 15 minutes of twists and turns, the novelty began to wear off. The houses grew farther apart, the streetlights became more infrequent, and a disquieting feeling began to settle over us. The sun had fully set, and we were in that gloomy twilight where everything is cast in shades of gray. I don't recognize any of this," I said, the laughter gone from my voice. We were lost. The streets were completely unnervingly deserted. No cars, no one walking their dog, no lights on in the windows. The only sound was the rustling of dry leaves skittering across the pavement. The silence was so absolute, it felt like we were the only two people left in the world. That's when we heard it. A single, clear whistle, cutting through the silence. It was a happy, simple tune, a children's song, and it was chillingly out of place. We turned around. Standing at the far end of the street, half shrouded in shadow, was a man. He was dressed as a clown, his clothes tattered and dirty. In one hand, he held a small bunch of 3 balloons that floated limply by his side. In the other, he held a large, glinting butcher knife. For a second, our brains couldn't process the scene. It felt like a bizarre prank, something from a movie. I even managed a nervous, "Hello?" He didn't answer. The whistling stopped. He just stood there, staring. Then he started whistling again, the same cheerful, maddening tune, and began walking towards us. It wasn't a run, just a slow, deliberate, unhurried walk. But we ran. We sprinted, our hearts exploding in our chests, our sneakers pounding against the asphalt. We took the first corner we could, then another, running blindly into the unfamiliar suburban maze. After a full minute of running, we stopped, gasping for breath, and listened. Silence. We thought we'd lost him. Then we heard it again. The whistling. It wasn't behind us anymore. It was coming from the end of the street in front of us. We looked, and there he was. The same clown, the same balloons, the same knife, still just walking at that same calm pace. It was impossible. There's no way he could have gotten there that fast. Panic turned into pure, primal terror. We screamed and ran again, this time with the horrifying realization that this wasn't a normal chase. No matter which way we turned, no matter how fast we ran, he would somehow appear ahead of us or across the street or just around the next corner, always walking, always whistling. He was herding us, playing with us. The quiet, empty streets had become his personal hunting ground, and we were the prey. Finally, in a desperate move, we dove into a thick, overgrown hedge separating 2 dark houses. We burrowed into the center, pulling the branches around us, trying to make our breathing silent. We stayed there, cramped and trembling for what felt like an eternity. We could hear the whistling pass by our location once, twice, then fade into the distance. We waited a full half-hour in absolute silence before we dared to move. We crept out, and with our sense of direction slowly returning, we finally found a familiar street. The rest of the walk to Sarah's house was a paranoid, terrified ordeal, our heads constantly whipping around at every sound. Just as we turned onto her block, we saw him one last time. He was standing under a streetlight, his back to us, just staring at an empty house, the balloons still bobbing gently. We didn't wait to see what he would do. We ran the final 100 yards and burst through her front door. We spent the next week trying to convince ourselves it was just an elaborate, terrifying prank, but the feeling of being hunted lingered, a cold dread that had shattered our sense of safety. Then we saw it on the local news, a report about a man who had been non-fatally attacked in a nearby park. The description of his assailant was chillingly familiar, a man in a torn clown costume, carrying a butcher knife. The police hadn't found him. We just looked at each other, the blood draining from our faces. It wasn't a prank. He was real. And we understood that on our innocent little walk, one wrong turn made us the main characters in a horror movie. We were just the lucky ones whose story didn't end that night.
The biggest red flag I ever ignored was a bedroom where everything, and I mean everything, was watching me with a painted smile. I'd been working with Emily for about a year. She was smart, funny, a little quirky, but in a charming way. We'd gone out a few times, always casual, always fun. So when she invited me back to her place for a nightcap after a painfully boring corporate fundraiser, I didn't hesitate. Her home was exactly what I'd expected. The downstairs was clean, modern, and tastefully decorated. We sat on her comfortable couch, drinking a beer and laughing about our coworkers. The conversation was easy and normal. There was absolutely nothing to suggest that the night was about to take a sharp turn into the deeply unsettling. After a while, she smiled and asked if I wanted to come upstairs. I agreed, and she led me up a dimly lit staircase to her bedroom. "Make yourself comfortable," she said, gesturing towards the bed. "I'll just be a minute." She disappeared into the adjoining bathroom, closing the door behind her. The only light in the room came from a single low-wattage lamp on a bedside table, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. I sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the initial awkwardness of being in a coworker's private space, and let my eyes wander around the room as they adjusted to the gloom. At first, all I saw were silhouettes, and then I saw the first one. Hanging on the wall directly across from the bed was a large framed portrait. It depicted a clown in an old-fashioned suit, but his grin was too wide, his eyes two chips of black ice. A cold feeling, sharp and unpleasant, pricked at the back of my neck. I've had a crippling fear of clowns, full-blown coulrophobia since I was a kid. I tried to look away, but it was like a magnet. My eyes darted to the two bedside tables flanking the bed. On each one sat a porcelain clown statue, both posed to be looking directly at the pillows, directly at where I was sitting. Their painted smiles seemed to mock me in the dim light. My heart started to beat faster. This wasn't just one weird piece of art. This was a theme. I stood up, my own breathing suddenly loud in the quiet room. I saw more. A framed photo on the dresser of a clown playing golf. A series of small, hand-drawn pictures of clowns with distorted, screaming faces tacked to a corkboard. My blood ran cold. Every single piece of decor was a clown, and none of them were the funny circus kind. They were all monsters, nightmares. The final piece of the puzzle, the one that made me truly start to panic, was another portrait, this one hanging directly over the headboard, angled slightly downward. It was a demonic-looking clown with pointed teeth and hollow black pits for eyes, positioned to stare down at whoever was sleeping in the bed. I felt a wave of pure, unadulterated anxiety wash over me. My mind started racing, replaying every normal conversation I'd ever had with Emily, searching for a sign I'd missed. I mentally mapped my escape route, down the stairs and out the front door. I half expected the bathroom door to swing open and for her to be standing there in full makeup, holding a knife. The silence from the bathroom was no longer comforting. It was terrifying. I was in a monster's bedroom and I had no idea if the monster was coming back. The click of the bathroom doorknob was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. I flinched, my muscles tensing for a fight or flight that never came. The door opened, and Emily walked out, smiling, looking completely normal. She wasn't holding a weapon, she wasn't wearing makeup, she was just Emily. But the room had changed her. The normal, charming woman I knew was now just a mask she wore, and I felt like I had seen the terrifying reality underneath. I don't remember what I said. I mumbled some stupid excuse about an early morning and needing to leave. The drive home was silent. I couldn't listen to the radio. My mind was a slideshow of painted smiles and dead porcelain eyes. It wasn't a violent encounter. I was never in any real physical danger. But the horror was real. It was the horror of discovery, of realizing that the person you think you know can have a secret world that is your own personal nightmare. I'm still friendly with her at work. We still make small talk, but I will never, ever go back to her house. I know what's waiting at the top of those stairs.